Welcome, listener, to Story Premise. This is a storytelling podcast of fantasy, fiction, and folktales. Today's story is inspired by a tabletop RPG adventure created by my brother Craig Snow. We at Story Premise have altered and adapted it to a written format for your entertainment. I hope you enjoy this dark mystery. On the verge of shadow. Hank's boots splashed in the mud. He needed to escape. It was coming. Hank wove around the thatch house. His training may have given him the stamina to run, but it did not prepare him mentally for the terror of this ordeal. "It's gaining on us!" shouted a voice behind Hank. "We have to!" The yelling was cut off in a jarring instant. Hank didn't dare look back. The gate was 30 meters away. 20. 10. Suddenly his muddy boots slipped on the flagstones. Hank went sprawling. A foreboding rush of air swept toward him. Hank desperately scrambled up. He could feel it was right behind him, but the gate was so close. Hank felt a renewed burst of energy as he sprinted to the gate. Hank slammed into it, but it stood unyielding. He pounded on it desperately. Realizing all hope was lost, Hank slowly turned to confront what was pursuing him. It lingered just 3 meters away, rippling and swirling calmly. Hank was cornered against the gate. He stood unmoving, frozen with fear. Then, swiftly and softly, it struck. Rotors hummed in the wind. The deck of the lofty airship tilted and rocked with each breeze. Steam gently whistled from the various pipes aboard the deck of the Intrepid. The sun was peeking its glorious head over the eastern horizon. Down below, farmers and merchants were just stepping out into the daylight, shadowing their eyes as they looked upon the horizon. They seemed to be just waking up to greet the daylight. Soren felt a twinge of envy toward these farmers. He had already been awake for hours in anticipation of his assignment. He had recently graduated from the academy, only to be immediately dispatched on a high-priority assignment. He would be sent with 4 others of varying roles and experience. Sitting on the railing of the ship was Officer Riker Valdish. He had the most experience of all in the group. He was a proven marksman, with over 100 missions under his belt. The top of his head was bald, but the sides and back were still covered in gray hair. His hands were covered in scars from years of experience. Corporal Charles Pike was speaking to the captain of the ship. Charles was somewhat of a prodigy from his day. He had graduated from the academy at the top of his class just a few years ago. He specialized as the team's tracker. In addition, he had recently been promoted and would be leading out the mission. Charles was tall, had sandy blonde hair, and was always neatly shaved. Hung on his pack was a longsword. Officer Bruce Brackenwood was the team's muscle. He was currently helping some of the crew move some barrels and crates. Bruce wore a big black beard and grunted more than he spoke. His shoulders were broad and wide. He was hundreds of pounds of pure muscle. Soren was not sure how people got to be that large. And then there was Hector Zeppelin. Hector was their demolitions expert. Currently he was sitting on the deck fiddling with some matches. That's not a good sign, thought Soren. In the few interactions Soren had with Hector, he learned a few things about him. First, Hector was somewhat of a pyromaniac. He was always wanting to light something on fire. Second, Hector's family was known for being the inventors of the airship. As such, Hector was always trying to find some way to outdo this achievement. He seemed to want some sort of recognition, but didn't know how to achieve it. Maybe that's why he's always playing with fire, thought Soren. He wants to invent something. Physically, Hector was somewhat pudgy and had black hair with some scruff on his face. Each member of the squad was equipped with some standard equipment. Everyone wore a standard-issue military pack with a set of extendable glider wings for short-distance flight. Each officer also had some form of grappling hook gun. Riker's was built into a sleeve on his uniform. The others each carried a handheld version. Soren had practiced thoroughly with his. A trigger, once pulled, would send out the grapple and a rope. Another button would reel in, allowing for quick traversal of an environment. Lastly, each member of the team carried a signature weapon. Charles had his longsword, Riker had a crossbow, and Bruce had a steam-powered warhammer. Hector carried a belt of prepared Molotov cocktails, complete with fuses. Soren, however, had some tricks up his sleeve as well. His weapon of choice were 2 silver blades strapped on his forearms. They could extend and retract at the push of a button. "Destination in sight," bellowed the ship's captain, Reginald Davenport. The 5 members of the team meandered over to the helm of the ship. "I'm sure you all know the task, but I'll debrief you anyway," Reginald said. "Our intelligence reports that all commerce, traffic, and communication have ceased with the royal city of Fallenvale. There are no lights, no guards on the wall, and the gates stand locked. The entire situation is quite perplexing. A few nights ago we sent a team to investigate what happened. We were set to extract the squad the next morning. When we arrived at the extraction point, there were no signs of them." Hector gulped loudly. "I'm not sure who or what's out there, but your role is to gather intel. Find out what happened to the city and our initial reconnaissance team. We're dropping you off first thing in the morning. We won't stick around, so don't expect backup." He furrowed his brow sternly. "We'll be back tomorrow morning at first light to pick you up. Any questions?" Soren couldn't believe his ears. "No backup?" He and the others shook their heads in reply to the captain. "Perfect. We should be over the city now." Soren looked over the ship's starboard side to see a city below. Great walls enclosed it. It had many houses and a keep. A clock tower began to toll. It was 9 o'clock. There were also a few other key buildings. There was a steam mill, with smoke still above it. There was also a mausoleum, with a graveyard surrounding it. In the north, an airship docking station sat, just adjacent to the keep. The ship lowered, and moments later, Soren and the others zipped down cables to the ground below. Charles landed first, kneeling, his hand flat on the ground in practiced precision. Bruce was next. He slammed into the ground, bending his knees slightly. Then came Riker, who rolled out of his landing, crossbow at the ready, scanning the cityscape before him. Soren came next. He swallowed his nerves and landed just fine on his feet. He let out a sigh of relief. Smack! Hector slipped off the cable just moments before the ground and face-planted into the cobbled street. He hastily stood up and brushed himself off. Charles immediately barked out orders, sword drawn. "Riker, take right flank. Hector, left flank. Bruce, bring up the rear. Soren, you take point with me." The team fanned out slightly. They all moved to their respective positions. Soren moved to the front of the formation with Charles. Charles spoke quietly to Soren, his eyes looking around as he spoke. "First mission, huh?" Soren nodded. Charles continued. "I'll show you the ropes. When you take point, you dictate the direction of the group, like so. All clear. Move out." They were on the main street of the city. Street kiosks lined the cobbled road. Wares lay unattended in booths. Papers were strewn about, fluttering with each gust of wind. "Hold position," Charles said. He stopped near one particular booth. "I've not seen such fine silks abandoned like this." He stroked his chin in thought. "Proceed forward." The squad followed in formation as Charles led the way through an alleyway toward one of the city houses. The door of the house was slightly ajar. "Cover the perimeter. Soren and I will go in." Charles kicked the door open. Soren rushed inside with him. They each split to different sides. Soren scanned the room. It appeared to be a standard residence. They were in a kitchen and living area. On the kitchen table sat a pot and bowls with spoons inside. Flies flew around the tableware. Rotten soup still sat in the open bowls, filling the air with a putrid smell. The chairs around the table sat a small distance away from the table, askew. One chair was even on its side. "All clear." Charles stepped out of the bedroom to the side. "No signs of life. What do you make of this?" "Well," Soren began, "there are no signs of a struggle here, but from the layout of the kitchen, it seems like whoever was here got up from dinner to run out the door." "That makes sense to me," Charles said. "The rug near the entrance is also folded over. It's possible that the people here made a hasty escape from the house. But why?" Charles stood musing. "We'd better get a move on," he said after a moment. They resumed their search by studying other houses. It seemed to be the same situation with many. Some houses had overturned bedsheets, others had broken furniture, but all showed signs of a frantic attempt to get out. Charles studied the ground. "It's hard to tell because of the days that have passed, but it seems that the footprints lead southward through the city. However, this is odd." "What?" Soren asked. I see it too, Riker said. Some of the tracks end randomly, as if the people who made them ceased to exist. Charles finished the sentence. I don't believe in superstition, but I don't like this situation. The bell began to toll. It was now 11 o'clock. Soren took a step away from the house, a crunch sounding underneath his boot as he did so. There was a poster underneath him. He picked up the poster and looked at it. On it were the words, Royal Coronation for future High King Dan Grodin. Saturday, July 25th, A523. Charles, take a look at this. Soren handed Charles the poster. Charles looked intently at it. That was the day we lost communication with the city. But what could that mean? Charles stood deep in thought. After a moment, he snapped out of his trance. Well, Soren, you're on point, Charles said. Where do you want to look next? Soren looked around him. There were plenty of points of interest to analyze, but where exactly? There was a church spire, and a wreath of smoke coming from a building to the north. I think we need to check the steam mill soon, but the chapel is on our way, so let's go there next. You heard him, men? Move out, Charles commanded. They trekked their way through the city, still fanned out and looking around warily. The chapel was in sight. Soren approached the doors and pushed on them. They wouldn't budge. He beckoned for the others to help. Charles and Hector came forward and tried pushing as well. Nothing. Bruce grunted and walked to the doors. He pushed the others out of the way. Bruce lugged the steam hammer off his back and raised it into the air. At the press of a button, steam erupted from the hammer, and its end rocketed into the chapel door. An ear-splitting crash echoed through the chamber. Bruce stood back and surveyed his handiwork. A massive hole stood in the chapel door, big enough for even Bruce to fit through. Bruce grunted in approval and gestured for the others to step through. Charles went through first. Soren was next. As he climbed through the hole, Soren realized why the doors would not open. There was a barricade of pews pushed up against them. The rest of the hall was disorganized and empty. A podium sat at the end of the chapel. When the rest of the squad entered, they walked together to the end of the chapel. Hector stepped up to the podium. What's this? He lit a match. He held the match close to a book that sat atop the podium. Charles snatched the book from Hector. Careful. Charles glared at Hector for a moment before looking at the book. It's a law book. What does it say? Soren asked. Let's see. I'll just read the page that the book is open on. Upon the death of the king, if there is no lawful heir, the High Chancellor will take the throne. The kingship will then follow the new dynasty of the former High Chancellor. See Section 6, Addendum 3 for the replacement of High Chancellor. Alternatively, if the king has no living heir, he may appoint a citizen within the kingdom to be his heir. This must be verified by announcement and written proof in the king's own hand, marked by his seal. Looks like there's something else on the podium, Hector said. Sure enough, to the side of the law book was a scrap of paper. Charles flipped the paper over, cleared his throat, and began to read. Save us, O thou great divine. Defend us in this awful time. For darkness seeks our lives to reap. Protect us, lest we die. The hairs began to stand up on Soren's neck. It was the feeling he got when he was being watched. He shook the feeling. Riker, what do you make of this? Charles asked. Desperation, probably. People will pray to any deity if they feel they are in danger, Riker answered. He was scanning the room thoroughly, slight concern in his eyes. We'd better move on, Charles said. The bell tolled 12 times as the squad climbed back out of the chapel. Soren led the way to a metal-rimmed wood building. Through the chimney, steam could be seen rising from the roof. Hector, you're probably the most well-versed in this technology. What is this place for? Charles asked. There's lots. It's a simple design, really. Hector puffed up his chest in pride. The gear house provides universal power to the major systems of the city. Using a series of solenoids and junctions, it simultaneously ignites roadway and residential lamps. Its pneumatic design also helps drive filtered water through the underground aquifer to provide both aesthetic and life-essential amenities to the general public. Huh? Bruce grunted. It lights the city lamps, gives the people running water, and makes the city fountains work, Riker translated. Good to know, Charles said. Lead the way, Soren. Soren put an ear to the gearhouse door. He could hear the whistling of air and the clinking of metal. The door opened with a creak as Soren pushed it. He stepped inside. The room was several degrees warmer than the outside. The machinery worked diligently. Brass pipes adorned the room, scaling the walls. The room was also full of crates overflowing with coal. A set of stairs led upward into another room. Soren continued up the stairs. He reached the top, then almost tripped on something on the ground. He gasped. Below him, clad in silver chainmail, was the body of a dead knight. The knight's body was face down, one arm outstretched. "Charles, I think you should see this," Soren said. Charles knelt down and gently rolled the body over. There were several crossbow bolts embedded in the knight's chest and abdomen. The knight's hand clutched something to his chest. Charles opened the knight's hand to reveal a golden key. "You better hold on to this, Soren." Charles handed the key over. "I found something too." Hector was reaching into a coal furnace on the opposite end of the room. He pulled his arm out. Clutched in his hand was a crumpled up wad of paper. "It's not even burned, and it's been sitting in the center of the furnace. That's not possible." He smoothed out the paper. "It's just got weird gibberish markings." Soren looked at the paper. It had some strange organized markings. Another language, maybe? Soren's thoughts were cut off by some yelling from across the room. "Riker?" Bruce bellowed. Charles stood up urgently. "What's the matter?" "Riker's gone," Bruce said. "What? He was right behind us when we came in here." Charles ran to the stairs, but stopped right at the top. Soren caught up when Charles raised a hand. Soren stopped dead in his tracks. Down at the bottom of the stairs, in front of the door, was a dark mass of mist, swirling in place. "Whatever you are, stand down," Charles said. The black mist did not move. Charles drew his sword and slowly stepped down the stairs. The others gaped in concern as Charles approached the mass of darkness. Then, quick as lightning, the mist moved straight at Charles. Charles swung his sword at that instant, only for the weapon to pass harmlessly through the fog. Blackness swallowed Charles, and he vanished instantly, his longsword clattering to the ground. A moment later, darkness streamed rapidly toward the stairs. "Go!" Bruce yelled to Soren. A hiss of steam erupted from his hammer as Bruce crashed the head of it into the stairs and the banister. The wood splintered and the stairs collapsed. "Over here!" Hector yelled. He pointed to a window high up in the building. Through the window, Soren could see the edge of another roof. Soren's hands fumbled in his pack as he pulled out his grapple gun. He fired at the building. His shot missed. He quickly pressed the button to reel in the rope. As it reeled in, he looked over his shoulder to see the black mist drifting up the walls to Bruce. A tendril reached out at Bruce as he swung his hammer at it. Bruce was growling loudly. Hector's first shot latched onto the adjacent building successfully. He zipped away, bumping into the walls before disappearing out the window. Finally, Soren's grapple gun was ready once more. As he took aim, Bruce's growling and bellowing was suddenly cut off. Soren fired his grapple and closed his eyes in anticipation. Clink! Soren immediately clicked the button to reel in the grapple, half expecting an empty response. He was surprised to find himself propelled through the air. He looked back to see a black tendril reaching out for him, inches away. Soren flew upward to meet the daylight. He reached the rooftop where the grapple had brought him. He jumped off the roof, pressing a button to release the wings from his pack. Soren slowly glided to the ground. Hector was on the ground, slowly climbing to his feet. He started limping to catch up with Soren. He was breathing hard. "Didn't activate my wings on time. Guess it's just us two now," Hector grimaced. Soren nodded gravely. They weren't safe yet. "We'd better put some distance between us and that thing before it finds us again." Soren and Hector hid for some time, eating rations and trying to formulate a plan. Soren cleared his throat. "Backup isn't coming for a while. We should continue investigating. Let's try the mausoleum next." I don't know," Hector started. "I don't do well in places like that." "Well, we need to check out all of our leads. Plus, a mausoleum seems like a likely source for a monster." "Exactly," said Hector. "I think we just need to get out of here. Hit the road. Pretend like we're travelers. Then forget this ever happened." Hector seemed pretty stubborn, but Soren had an idea. "Hey, Hector." "What?" said Hector tentatively. "Your family invented the airship, right?" "Well, my last name is Zeppelin, so yeah. My grandfather, Weston Zeppelin, is the famous one." Hector looked slightly embarrassed. "Maybe if we solve this will make you just as famous." "You really think so?" "Yeah, just think about it. Hector the Bold, vanquisher of darkness," Soren said, flourishing his hand in the air. "That does have a nice ring to it." Hector looked thoughtful. "Although Hector the esteemed slayer of shadow sounds a bit better." "Works for me," Soren shrugged his shoulders. "I'll tell everyone about how you single-handedly defeated a monster that destroyed a city. I'll even tell that one girl. What was her name?" "Ah, yes, Natalia." Hector's eyes lit up. "Well, we had better get going if we want to slay a monster." The bell tolled 4 times. There were only a couple of hours before the sun would start to go down. The 2 officers needed to find out what was going on. Soren didn't like the idea of what might happen after nightfall. They reached the mausoleum at the final toll of the bell. There was a ring of obelisks around the graveyard. Immediately to the side of the mausoleum, they found one grave that had been freshly dug. It was dug deep into the ground, yawning open to consume any coffins that would be placed within. Freshly carved into a large gravestone were the words, "Dan Gurdon, High General and Noble Friend, Heir to the Kingdom of Fallenvale." "Dan Gurdon," Soren said. "Heir to the kingdom? You don't think this is connected to—" "What's that awful smell?" Hector exclaimed. A fetid reek of decay struck Soren's nose. Soren could hear the buzzing of insects just behind the mausoleum. He walked to the source, Hector a few steps behind. Laying down on a stone table was the decaying corpse of a man in regal attire. Near his body were a few sets of embalming tools. Soren didn't dare come too close. There was no telling what diseases were present here. Soren and Hector investigated the rest of the premises. They stepped into the large mausoleum, finding only the undisturbed burial vaults of kings. There was nothing of interest here. Still, some of the pieces of the mystery sank together. The coronation, the heir, obviously killed recently. Was the monster somehow responsible? But why was the heir's body still left behind while the people were gone? The bell tolled 5 times. Walking out of the cemetery, Soren spoke up. "I suspect we may need to check out the keep next. We're losing daylight." Hector gave no protest to leaving the burial site. The keep stood dauntingly at the end of the city. It was made of gray stone blocks mortared together and slightly eroded by time. Just before the keep, the airship docking port was visible. "I've got to thinking," Hector started. "I think we need an escape route, just in case. There are 2 perfectly usable, however outdated, airships docked at the port. They're close enough to the ground that I should be able to get up there and rig them to work." "We don't have much time," Soren said. "Otherwise, I would not be opposed." "Let me at least start up one of the generators to fill one ship's envelope with hydrogen. I think we'll need it," Hector said stubbornly. "Fine, but be quick about it. I'll try to find a good way into the keep," Soren said. "The doors seem too conspicuous." It was about 5:30 when Soren finished rigging his setup. Using his grapple gun, he made his way to the outer wall of the city. He threw down a rope for easy access. From here, he and Hector would be able to glide down to the keep's eastern tower. Through a trapdoor, they could go inside the keep. Hector arrived soon, the low hum of a generator sounding from the airship port. "We should be good to go," he said. This time, neither of the 2 fumbled the glide takeoff. They hovered down to the very top of the keep tower. Soren always relished the opportunity to fly. "Are you ready?" Soren asked Hector. Hector shook his head. "Great, let's go." Soren opened the trapdoor and went inside. The stairwell was dark. The waning light of the sun cast shadows throughout the staircase. As the 2 crept deeper down the stairs, they could see less and less. On the wall were several sconces for torches. For once, it made Soren feel safer that Hector had matches. Hector lit 2 torches, handing one to Soren. Taking a deep breath, Soren stepped through one of the second-story doors. Through the door was an empty hallway. Dust hovered in the air, almost glowing in the torchlight. The silence in the halls was chilling. Soren could hear every breath that he and Hector took. It almost echoed off the cold walls. The hallway led them to a branching corridor. Separate paths went right, left, and forward. Scattered across the walls were doors leading to different rooms. Soren turned to see Hector reach his hand to one door cautiously. Hector pushed the door open tentatively. Inside the room was a bed and wardrobe. The bed sheets were thrown across the floor, in a similar manner to what Soren had seen in the houses. "Just a normal room," Hector noted. He closed the door. "Maybe this is the residence section of the keep," whispered Soren. "Let's sweep through the whole castle, then we can make a detailed search after." They left the room and continued down the hallway going forward. The hallway met a balcony overlooking a vast room. Soren looked down to see several great pillars surrounding a large stone basin. A fist-sized hole sat at the bottom of it. "The pump system must not be functioning," muttered Hector. "What do you mean?" whispered Soren. "See the oil stains on the side of the basin?" Hector said. "Normally a great fire would be lit in the center of this great hall. It appears that the basin ran out of oil, though I suspect the problem is not with the basin in particular. The lamps on the walls are out as well." Throughout the walls were several fixtures that Soren recognized to be lamps akin to what he had seen on the streets of the city. Without another word, the two moved on. They continued down a hallway just off the balcony. The hall met a set of stairs going down. Soren and Hector descended the stairs and down another hallway. Left, right, straight. This was almost a labyrinth, thought Soren. He was noting all the turns they were making so they wouldn't get lost. Eventually they came into what happened to be a guard garrison. Racks of weapons and armor lined the walls. Through a slit in the wall, it could be seen that night had now fallen. Soren and Hector walked through quickly. There was an ominous sense of tension in the air. They needed to find the source of this place's problem, and fast. The next room was larger than the last. A couple stone workbenches with tools atop them stood on either side of a large bronze apparatus. The apparatus stood in another basin. As they stepped closer, Soren noticed that the basin was full of a thick, black substance. Hector put a fingertip in the substance and licked his finger. He spat. "Oil. This is the pump." Hector ran a hand around the apparatus, his hand eventually residing on a withered pipe sticking outward. This pipe appeared to be severely deformed. Hector looked around on the ground for a second. He reached down and picked up a brass wheel. The wheel was badly deformed as well. "It appears that the oil pump has been tampered with," Hector said finally. "Given the right tools, I could fix it." "We don't have time for that," Soren protested urgently. "It's already dark outside." The sense of dread in the air continued to build as they made their way down another maze of hallways. All feelings of comfort were waning. They stepped into a spacious room, lined with pillars. A regal throne sat at the end of it. Banners adorned each of the pillars. Despite what would normally be a grand spectacle, Soren and Hector felt no need to linger. They quickly glanced through the room before splitting through another hallway. The bottles on Hector's belt clinked as they ran. All pretense of stealth was now gone. The pressure in their hearts was almost unbearable. "We need to get out of here," Soren spoke much louder than before, hearing his own voice just barely over the sound of his beating heart. "There, the stairs to another tower. Maybe we can make it off the top with our gliders." Hector didn't protest. They were running up the stairs now. Their footsteps dully echoed off the stone stairs. Several flights passed. They were breathing hard when they reached a door at the top. Soren felt a brief sense of relief. They were almost out. He pushed the door open and ran inside the room ahead. Then his heart stopped, and his feet with it. Soren's eyes went wide. The room had no windows or outside access, but this was not what was so distressing. The torchlight illuminated much in the room, a bookshelf, a podium, but there was one thing that was not illuminated. An orb of pure darkness floated in the center of the room. Thick rings of mist swirled and rotated around it. Unlike the darkness they saw earlier, however, this did not move from its place. "Could this be..." Hector started. "Where it began?" Soren finished. The podium in the room stood right in front of the black orb. Atop the podium was a book. The book was open to a specific page. The right page of the section was torn out. "Let me see that paper you have," Soren said urgently. Hector handed him the crumpled up wad from the furnace. Soren smoothed out the page. He lined it up to the tear in the book. It was a perfect match. Hector reached to his belt and pulled out a bottle. He lowered his torch and lit a fuse at the bottle's top. Sparks started flying. "You say this is where it began? How the mist was created?" Hector asked. "I think so," Soren replied. Soren saw something different in Hector's eyes than he had ever seen before. Determination. Hector threw the flaming bottle at the rotating mass of blackness. It passed through the blackness, and a crash of glass sounded. The Molotov splashed harmlessly on the other side, completely extinguished. Soren heard the creak of hinges behind him. He whirled around to look at the door, but only the top corners of it were visible. Instead, a formless mass of darkness obstructed the only exit from the room. It was the dark mist from the gear house. Hector gasped. The dark mist shot straight at Soren, who was standing right in front of the podium. Soren dove out of the way, the shadow just barely missing him. Soren rolled to his feet, facing the dark mass. The dark mass struck again, tendrils reaching towards Soren. An explosion rocked the air, right where the dark mist was. For a brief moment, Soren could see a humanoid silhouette within the black mist. "Run!" screamed Hector. The form was writhing within the mist. Without hesitation, Soren bolted toward the door and started pounding down the stairs. Hector was just ahead of him. Soren reached the bottom of the staircase and continued through the maze of corridors. He could feel the whipping of the wind and hear the rushing of air behind him. He turned his head to see the writhing black mist pursuing him. Soren waved his torch behind him. The mist recoiled for a moment, but did not give up pursuit. They reached the throne room. Hector stopped, looking for an exit. Soren caught up and dragged Hector one way. Up ahead was the room with the empty stone basin. They sprinted through the room, seeing a set of great double doors ahead. "Hector! Buy us more time!" Soren yelled. Soren was fumbling in his pocket for something. "Way ahead of you!" Hector ignited another Molotov. They reached the doors. A wall of flame rose behind them. Soren pulled the gleaming key out of his pocket. His fingers fumbled. "Hurry!" Hector said nervously. Click. The key fit seamlessly into the lock. Soren turned the key and pushed the heavy door. It slowly creaked open. Hector started pushing too. There was almost enough room to fit. The illumination in the room went out. The wall of flame was gone. Soren shoved Hector through the opening, cramming himself through as well. They were out. Clouds covered the dark night sky. Soren and Hector didn't dare look as they ran through the streets and alleyways. "I think we've lost it," Soren panted, his lungs burning. "What do we do now?" Hector's eyes lit up for a moment. "Do you hear that?" he said. Soren was confused. He stopped to listen. "Just the wind and the airship generator." "Exactly," Hector said. "The airship's envelope should be full of hydrogen now." "You're right," Soren said jubilantly. "We can escape and come back later." Hector's mouth split into a grin. "Actually, I have a better idea." The dark mist appeared to be prowling the streets. It was hard to see in the darkness of the night, but Soren could barely make it out. It twisted and veered through the alleyways. Hector and Soren waited for the mist to pass before they made their way sneakily through the city. The airships came into sight. They were docked at the port. One airship was low to the ground, sagging slightly. The other sat aloft and proud in the air, its envelope swollen above it. The only thing holding them to the ground was a set of 4 ropes on each. They took their positions. Soren was in the port station, and Hector was on the ground beside the high-floating airship. Hector fired his grapple gun, where it latched itself onto the airship railing. Hector turned to Soren and nodded, a look of brave conviction on his face. Soren slammed a button on the station console. A small light flashed on top of the station. It blinked once in the night sky. These emergency station lights were not very bright, but they would do as a signal, or a distraction. A few moments later, the expected dark mist could be seen converging on the airship port. It was rapidly approaching Hector. It was within meters of him before Hector pushed a button on his grapple gun. He spiraled upward to the deck of the airship. The mist swirled and darted up one of the rope tethers. As the mist flowed upward, Hector pulled out a dagger and severed the rope. The mist fell to the ground, but immediately rushed for another cable. Hector, however, did not cut this rope. The dark mist was moving upward, unhindered to the airship's deck. "What are you doing?" Soren screamed. "Sever the rope! Hit it with a Molotov while you can!" The darkness was almost to the deck now. Hector turned his head to look at Soren, a wistful smile on his face. "Tell Natalia I was brave. Tell my dad I wasn't a complete screw-up. Tell my grandpa that I did something right." "Hector, no!" Soren screamed. The mist was on the deck now, black tendrils groping toward Hector. In one swift motion, Hector cut the ship's envelope open with his dagger and put his torch to the tear. The air shook as the airship exploded. Soren's ears were ringing. Pieces of fire and debris were raining down on the ground. Soren shook his groggy head and leapt down from the port's window. He ran to the blazing wreckage. Hector was on the ground, his chest rising and falling heavily. He was covered in burns. "Hector, are you okay?" Soren said, rushing to his friend's side. Hector coughed out 2 words. "Finish it!" He weakly pointed to one side. In the direction of Hector's gesture, a thin, dark mist swirled around a crumpled figure just mere meters away. The figure got up to its feet, then turned its head to look at Soren. It was a man's face. The man had sleek black hair and eyes that gleamed with indignation. He turned, limping away. Soren sped off in pursuit, closing the gap with ease. As the distance decreased, the man slowly started to dissipate into mist. Knowing that his opportunity was limited, Soren activated the retractable blades hidden in his sleeves. He swung his blades. They passed harmlessly through the figure, who was now enveloped in a shroud of darkness. Soren wished he hadn't left his torch back in the airship port. He stopped, and so did the mist. Soren had failed. This mist could obliterate him in an instant, and he could do nothing to combat it. The mist glided towards Soren, who prepared himself for a last stand. Charles, Bruce, and now Hector had given their lives for him. Soren refused to go down without a fight. The mist was nearly upon him, when suddenly the landscape lit up slightly. Soren looked up to see that the moon was showing. No longer did clouds obscure its bright face. Soren looked down to see the mist shroud drop around the man within. The man reached Soren, stretching out his shadowy arms. Soren struck with his blades twice, meeting flesh. His assailant stumbled to his knees, eyes locked on Soren, full of venom and anger. Then he collapsed to the ground. The black mist swirled and dissipated completely in the wind. The great pressure in the air lessened. Soren retracted his blades and wiped the sweat off his brow. It was finished. Soren looked up to find that he was surrounded by people. They were looking around, confused and disoriented. Soren paid them no mind. He ran back to Hector's side. Soren shook Hector's shoulder. "Hector, we did it!" "Hector?" After a moment, Hector's eyes opened, and a smile spread through his face. "We did it." They were back aboard the Intrepid, heading home. Soren stood on the outer deck, the air rushing through his hair. Footsteps approached Soren on the deck. "Hector is stable," Charles said, leaning on the deck railing. "I'd say that was a successful first assignment for you. I'm impressed you were able to solve this mystery. The people of Fallenvale are safe and grateful. I think promotions and honors are due." "I think we owe the credit to Hector. He would have died for this cause." "I think that will make Hector happy. He feels a certain pressure to live up to his name. I will recommend both of you to the General. I see great things in your future," Charles said. "I'm just happy everyone's okay," Soren shrugged. "I wouldn't say everyone," Charles said sadly. "Fallenvale lost some good men during the crisis. But that is a story for another day." Thanks for listening. This tale was written by Story Premise, and based off a creation by my brother Craig Snow. If you would like to submit a story or an idea of yours, email me at the link in the description. Stick around on our channel for the upcoming backstory to this tale.